It was a typical afternoon in Manhattan, the kind of day when the sun casts a soft, golden light over the bustling streets, and the frenetic pace of the city seems to slow down a bit. I had decided to take a break from work and visit the local cafe, a small haven of calm amidst the urban chaos. The place was cozy, with its walls adorned with old photos and a soft jazz playlist playing in the background. I was sitting at a table near the window, enjoying a cappuccino and trying to unwind after a stressful morning. As I lost myself in thoughts and in reading a book, the cafe door opened with a jingle of bells, and a woman entered, immediately catching my attention. She seemed out of place, as if she were somewhere she didn't belong. She wore a dark wool coat that looked slightly out of date and sunglasses, despite it already getting dark. Her gaze was furtive, and she scanned the room with palpable urgency. With hesitant steps, the woman approached my table. I looked up from my book, and she hesitated for a moment before opening a brown paper envelope. The surrounding noise seemed to fade, and a sense of expectation and discomfort took hold of me. "Sorry to interrupt, you're Daniel, right?" she asked, her voice hoarse and laden with an almost conspiratorial tone. Surprised, I confirmed my name, and a slight smile appeared on her face, as if an invisible burden had been lifted. She pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting for a response, which made me a bit uncomfortable. The woman then took a yellowed photograph out of the envelope, her trembling fingers extending it towards me. "I need you to see this," she said, her voice almost a whisper. The photo looked like it had been taken a long time ago. It was an image of an old, decaying mansion, a Victorian-style building that seemed shrouded in an aura of desolation. The sky behind the house was heavy and threatening, with dark clouds that seemed on the verge of unleashing a storm. The trees around the house were dry and withered, as if they were mourning what was to come. In the bottom right corner of the photo, an inscription was written in old, elaborate handwriting, "The Curse of the Forgotten." I looked at the photo, feeling a chill run down my spine. The image seemed to have a strange power, as if it were charged with sinister energy. The feeling that something was wrong was almost palpable. Not knowing what to say or do, I looked back at the woman, who was now looking at me with an expression of expectant hopelessness. "What is this?" I asked, trying to disguise my discomfort. She seemed to hesitate, as if struggling to find the right words. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and urgent. "This photo brings bad luck to those who see it. I was told to show it to someone, and apparently, it's you who must see it. I don't know what will happen next, but be careful." Before I could ask more questions, the woman abruptly stood up, and without another word, she left the cafe. I watched her leave, her coat billowing as she disappeared into the busy street. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The feeling of discomfort persisted, and I couldn't get the image of the photo out of my mind. The heavy sky and the decaying house seemed to have a deeper impact than I wanted to admit. I wondered if the woman was just trying to scare me or if there was something more sinister behind her visit. The fact that she left without explaining anything else only increased my unease. When I got home, I told Rebecca about the encounter and showed her the photo. She was also visibly disturbed, but we tried not to give too much importance to the event, considering it a strange whim of a stranger. However, the feeling that something was about to go wrong never left me, and a shadow of apprehension hung over us as the night approached. The night came, and with it, a persistent sense of unease. Rebecca and I tried to go about our routines, but the weight of the photo and the strange woman's words seemed to hover over us like a dark cloud. Sitting on the living room sofa, I tried to concentrate on some overdue emails, but the old photo and the gloomy house were constantly on my mind. Around 7 p.m., my phone, which was on silent mode, began to vibrate incessantly on the coffee table. I looked at the screen and saw that it was Rebecca. Unable to ignore the sense of urgency, I answered. "Daniel, you need to come home now." Her voice was filled with panic. "The lights are flickering and the TV turned on by itself." The fear in her voice was palpable. I tried to reassure her, saying I was on my way, but the sense of dread was already settling in. I closed the laptop and rushed to the car, a cloud of anxiety hanging over me. The drive home seemed interminable. The traffic was heavier than usual, and every minute felt like an eternity. As I drove, my thoughts were focused on how I would deal with whatever was happening at home. Fear and worry intertwined, creating a tight knot in my stomach. When I finally arrived home, the scene was an exact reflection of what Rebecca had described. The living room lights were flickering intermittently, and the TV was on a static channel, emitting a static sound that seemed to fill the room with an uncomfortable vibration. Rebecca was standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide and her hands trembling. "What's happening?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "I don't know, Daniel," she replied, her voice trembling. "It started with the lights flickering, and then the TV turned on by itself. I checked the outlets and switches, but everything seems normal. I can't understand it." The atmosphere was charged with a strange energy. The air felt dense and cold, and the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I examined the switches and outlets, but everything seemed to be in order. The TV's static sound seemed to intensify, and each flicker of light sent a shiver down my spine. We decided to try resetting the electrical devices and checking the electrical installations. With some effort, we managed to turn off the TV and the lights, but the feeling of discomfort persisted. Rebecca and I tried to discuss what might be causing the problems, but the conversation was difficult to maintain given the tense atmosphere enveloping the house. We sat on the sofa, trying to relax, but the environment felt increasingly oppressive. The sensation that something was about to happen was overwhelming. The sound of the TV static seemed to still echo in my mind, and every little noise in the house was amplified, causing a constant state of alert. As the night wore on, the strange events began to happen more frequently. Objects started moving on their own, and doors that were previously closed now stood ajar. It was as if an invisible force was playing with us, and there was no logical explanation for the happenings. Rebecca began to feel increasingly uneasy. Her eyes were tired, and her expression was worried. We tried to ignore the phenomena, but the feeling that something was out of control continued to haunt us. The growing tension between us only added to the sense that we were trapped in a situation we couldn't understand or control. What started as small oddities was quickly turning into something more sinister and disturbing. The photo and the woman's warning seemed to have a direct connection to what was happening. The coincidences were too many to ignore, and I couldn't escape the feeling that we were in the midst of something much deeper and darker than we had ever imagined. The following nights were a continuous nightmare. After the strange events of the previous night, I hoped the phenomenon might have been just an isolated incident. However, the reality was much more disturbing. Things began to escalate quickly, and fear turned into terror. That night, Rebecca and I tried to sleep, hoping that rest would help us regain some normalcy. But as night fell, the atmosphere in our house transformed into a scene of despair. Rebecca was exhausted and tense, and the worry was clearly etched on her face. The children, our young kids, were restless and agitated, a direct reflection of the oppressive atmosphere hanging over us. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a muffled scream. The sound was so sharp and desperate that I immediately got up and went to the children's room. There I found Rebecca sitting on the bed, her eyes wide open and her face pale. She was trembling and breathing rapidly. "Daniel, I'm seeing things," she said, her voice almost inaudible from fear. "There's someone in the hallway." Her vision, with wide eyes and trembling body, made my heart race. I tried to calm her down and assure her that there was no one there, but the fear in her eyes made me hesitate. The idea that something invisible was lurking seemed absurd, but the intensity of her fear was undeniable. I wandered through the hallway, checking every corner and opening every door. The house was silent and dark, and there were no signs of any presence. However, the feeling of an invisible presence was so strong it was almost palpable. The house's silence seemed loaded with a tension we couldn't ignore. Rebecca tried to go back to sleep, but the nightmares began to intensify. She would scream and writhe in bed, as if fighting against something only she could see. In her visions, she spoke of shadows moving along the walls and a sinister presence following her. Each time she woke up, she was drained and scared, and the night seemed endless. I tried everything to calm her down. We talked about things that made her feel safe, tried changing the environment with soft lights and relaxing music, but nothing seemed to work. The fear she felt was so real it started to manifest in me as well. Every small noise in the house became a threatening sound, and every shadow seemed to have its own movement. During the day, the atmosphere was loaded with residual fear. Even when the sun shone, the feeling of oppression and discomfort didn't dissipate. Rebecca and I tried to talk about what could be causing these events, but logical explanations were insufficient. What was happening was completely out of the ordinary. Each night, the nightmares became more frequent and intense. Rebecca seemed increasingly exhausted, and her emotional state was deteriorating. The house's atmosphere was so charged with fear it became difficult to distinguish what was real and what was a product of our imagination. The nightmares and constant feeling of being watched began to affect the children's behavior as well. They were irritable and had trouble sleeping, which only fed the cycle of anxiety and fear. We decided to seek external help. We consulted paranormal experts and sought information about similar events. Our efforts to understand and resolve the situation only left us more confused and terrified. The feeling of being plunged into something we didn't understand and couldn't control was terrifying. Every night turned into a battle to maintain sanity and the safety of our family. The fear was constant, and the shadow of the photo and the woman's warning seemed more present than ever. The house's environment became a reflection of our worst fears, and the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. What started as small strange events was quickly turning into an endless nightmare, and the hope that it might end seemed increasingly distant. The tension in our house seemed to grow each day, and the feeling that we were being consumed by something invisible was palpable. In the search for answers, we decided to investigate more deeply about the photo and any possible connection to the strange events we were experiencing. The idea that the photo might have some kind of hidden history or significance seemed to be our only clue. One day, after another night of nightmares and inexplicable oddities, I decided to go to the Manhattan Public Library to conduct more detailed research. The library, with its immense shelves and quiet atmosphere, was the ideal place to delve into books and historical records that might offer some explanation. I knew this search for information wouldn't be easy, but the need to understand what was happening was imperative. I spent hours combing through old records and books on local history. The image of the house in the photo continued to haunt me, and every time I looked at it, a chill ran down my spine. The Victorian building seemed to have an aura of desolation that deepened with each new discovery I made. It was during the research in historical records that I found something relevant. In an old book of records about properties and families in the area, I found a reference to a Victorian mansion that matched the description of the house in the photo. The mansion was located in a small town north of Manhattan called Thornwood. The records mentioned that the property had belonged to a prominent family in the 19th century, but after a series of tragic events, it was abandoned and fell into ruins. I was intrigued by the description of the tragic events. There were reports of mysterious deaths and disappearances involving the family that owned the house. The reports indicated that the family, known as the Everleys, had been plagued by a series of inexplicable tragedies, culminating in a devastating fire that destroyed part of the mansion. The remaining part of the property was left abandoned and eventually became a site known for urban legends and ghost stories. I returned home with a growing sense of urgency and a mix of anxiety and determination. The discovery that the house in the photo had such a dark history seemed to connect directly with the events we were experiencing. The fact that the house had been associated with deaths and tragedies seemed to explain, in some way, the negative energy that seemed to be affecting our family. When I got home, I told Rebecca about what I had discovered. She was exhausted and skeptical, but the connection to the Victorian mansion's history offered a new perspective. The feeling that the house's past might somehow be influencing our present seemed to be the only logical explanation for the events we had faced. We decided that the best approach would be to seek more information directly in Thornwood. Although the idea of traveling to an unknown town in search of answers was frightening, it seemed to be the only way to understand what was happening and possibly find a solution. I went to the local library and looked for a way to get to the old Everly Mansion, now known only as a point of interest for story hunters and local curious people. As we planned the trip, the fear of confronting what could be the source of our problems was palpable. The desperation to find answers and the need to protect our family were powerful motivators. The plan was to go to Thornwood, explore the abandoned property, and try to discover if there was any direct connection between the Everly Mansion and the strange events we were experiencing. The journey to Thornwood was marked by a feeling of trepidation and anticipation. The path to the small, isolated town seemed shrouded in an aura of mystery, and with each mile traveled, fear and anticipation grew. We believed the journey would be crucial to understanding what was happening and, perhaps, finding a way to reverse the negative influence hanging over us. Arriving in Thornwood was like entering a completely different world. The town, although picturesque and full of historical charm, had an atmosphere that seemed almost frozen in time. The streets were narrow and winding, and the old houses, with their wooden facades weathered by time, gave the feeling that the town was on the brink of oblivion. The gray, cloudy sky seemed to reflect the place's melancholy, intensifying the feeling that we were entering haunted territory. Our first stop was the small tourist information center, where we found an elderly woman who seemed to be the only resident willing to talk to us about the local history. The place was almost empty, except for a few old chairs and a large table full of pamphlets and books about the town's history. The woman, named Mrs. Callahan, had a shrewd look and a posture indicating she knew more than she appeared. "Welcome to Thornwood," said Mrs. Callahan, with a cordial smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What can I do for you?" I explained that we were interested in an old mansion that seemed to have a sad and mysterious history. When I mentioned the Everly name and the description of the mansion, Mrs. Callahan's face became somber. "Oh, the Everlys," she murmured, adjusting her glasses with a careful gesture. "That's a story many prefer to leave in the past. The Everly Mansion is at the end of the road, but it's not the best place to visit. There are rumors that the place is cursed." We were intrigued by her reaction. Mrs. Callahan seemed reluctant to share information, but she finally provided us with some directions and warned us to be careful. We left the shop with a mix of excitement and apprehension, aware that we were about to confront something that might be beyond our understanding. The Everly Mansion was located in a remote area of the town, at the end of a dirt road covered by a dense layer of dry leaves. As we approached, the atmosphere became heavier, and the surroundings seemed increasingly gloomy. The house was partially hidden by dense vegetation, and its decaying structure seemed to scream the decay and abandonment that enveloped it. We parked the car and approached the mansion's entrance. The rusty iron gate was partially open, swaying gently in the wind. The garden around the house was in complete disarray, with overgrown bushes and trees that seemed to lean over the house as if bidding it farewell. The air was laden with heavy humidity and a sense of discomfort that made every step more difficult. The mansion's facade, though impressive in its past grandeur, was now covered in dirt and deterioration. The windows were broken and covered in cobwebs, and the wooden doors were partially collapsed. The environment was so oppressive it seemed to absorb the sunlight, casting a ghostly glow over the place. Rebecca and I exchanged nervous looks before crossing the threshold of the front door. The mansion's interior was in a state of complete ruin. Dust-covered furniture and cobweb-covered walls were scattered throughout the rooms, and the smell of mold and decay filled the air. Every step made the wooden floor creak and seemed to amplify the eerie silence that enveloped us. We explored the rooms, finding remnants of what seemed to have been a luxurious life before the tragedy. There were old photographs on the walls, some of which showed the Everly family in happy moments. However, most of the pictures were dusty and damaged. The walls were covered in graffiti and strange marks, as if someone had tried to communicate something through the walls. Upstairs, we found an ajar door leading to a room that seemed to be the most untouched of all. The environment was charged with an unsettling energy. There was an old diary on a bedside table, covered in dust and grime. We decided to examine it carefully, hoping to find some clue about the tragic events that had occurred there. The diary belonged to one of the Everly family members and contained records of disturbing events and growing despair. From the entries, we learned about a series of inexplicable tragedies that befell the family, including mysterious deaths and supernatural events that seemed associated with an ancient curse. The records also mentioned a feeling of being haunted and a constant sense of a threatening presence, something that deeply resonated with what we were experiencing. Reading the diary left us shaken, but it also offered a new perspective on what was happening. The fact that the Everlys had faced something similar to what we were experiencing seemed to confirm that the mansion and the photo were connected in a much more sinister way than we had imagined. The feeling that we were dealing with something ancient and evil was becoming increasingly real. We left the mansion with a sense of desolation and a deeper understanding of the situation. The visit to Thornwood had revealed that we were dealing with a curse that had been fueled by decades of tragedy and suffering. The connection between the photo and the Everly Mansion's history was becoming clearer, and the need to find a solution to break the cycle of terror was more urgent than ever. With the discovery of the Everly Mansion and the disturbing details we found in the diary, our sense of urgency intensified. We knew that time was running out and that the curse seemingly triggered by the photo was deepening. The decision to return home and face the situation with what we had learned seemed inevitable. The plan was to seek a way to break the cycle of tragedies and find some solution to the negative influence that was dominating our lives. We returned to Manhattan, bringing with us the diary and the feeling of a growing weight. The atmosphere in our house was increasingly oppressive, and the sinister presence seemed to have intensified since our trip to Thornwood. Returning home was marked by a sense of despair and determination. We needed to act quickly to prevent the situation from worsening further. The first thing we did upon returning home was to gather the family and share what we had discovered. Rebecca, now completely exhausted and frightened, listened attentively as I explained the events that had occurred at the Everly Mansion and the disturbing details found in the diary. The children were visibly restless, and the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. We decided that the next step would be to perform some sort of ritual or ceremony to try to dispel the negative influence and break the curse. We had no experience with rituals, but the idea that some symbolic action could help restore normalcy seemed to be our only hope. To this end, we sought help from a specialist in spiritual and occult practices, someone who could guide us on how to deal with the situation. The specialist, a man named Michael, arrived at our house on a cold and cloudy day. He was a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and a look that reflected a deep understanding of the spiritual world. Michael had worked on similar cases before and seemed to be the kind of person who could help us face what we were going through. Upon entering our house, Michael quickly analyzed the environment and began preparing the space for the ritual. He brought a series of items and tools, including candles, dried herbs, and some esoteric symbols he explained were necessary to create spiritual protection around the house. His approach was meticulous and careful, and he seemed to have deep knowledge of how to deal with evil presences. While Michael prepared the environment, Rebecca and I began to feel slight relief. The threatening presence seemed to recede a bit, as if sensing the approach of something that could challenge it. The children were in their rooms, and we tried to create a calm and safe environment for them, away from what was happening in the main room. Michael began the ritual at night when the darkness seemed to envelop the house with an additional sense of discomfort. The atmosphere was tense, and the sound of the words Michael chanted seemed to fill the space with a peculiar vibration. He used the dried herbs and candles to create a line of protection around the room, and his words were recited with a ritualistic precision that seemed to amplify the concentration of spiritual energy. During the ritual, the strange events that had become common began to occur again. The lights flickered, and the TV turned on by itself, and the air seemed to become even denser and heavier. The feeling of being watched was more intense than ever, and the growing fear began to manifest in everyone's reactions in the house. The children were agitated, and the tension was so high it was difficult to remain calm. Michael continued the ritual with determination, focusing on dispelling the negative energies and breaking any connection to the dark past of the Everly mansion. He seemed focused and unperturbed despite the visible signs of resistance the environment was presenting. The atmosphere was charged with an energy that seemed to fight against the intervention, and the feeling that something was trying to hold on to our house was almost tangible. The ritual lasted several hours, and at the end, Michael seemed exhausted but satisfied with the work done. He believed we had taken significant steps to protect our house and possibly break the curse's influence. However, he also warned us that the residual energy could take some time to dissipate completely and that we should remain vigilant. After Michael left, the atmosphere in the house seemed to have changed. Although the tension hadn't completely disappeared, there was a noticeable relief, as if the house was beginning to recover from the dark weight it had carried. The feeling of being watched diminished, and the oddities became less frequent. However, we knew the battle wasn't over and that the coming days would be crucial to determining if the intervention had been successful or if the evil influence was still present, waiting to return. After Michael's ritual, the house seemed to have experienced a brief period of calm. The oddities diminished, and the tension that once seemed to be in every corner began to dissipate. However, even with this apparent improvement, the feeling that something was still lurking never left us. The presence that had infiltrated our lives seemed to be just waiting for the right moment to manifest again. The first night after the ritual was relatively quiet. The children managed to sleep without interruptions, and Rebecca and I tried to relax in the living room, attempting to regain a sense of normalcy. However, there was a persistent feeling that we were merely on the verge of something bigger, a final manifestation of evil that might have only been delayed. Around 3 a.m., I was awakened by a loud noise coming from downstairs. The sound was a crash, followed by a series of creaks reverberating through the house's walls. I woke Rebecca, and with my heart racing, we went downstairs to investigate. The fear was palpable, and every step seemed to echo threateningly. When we reached the living room, we found a scene of chaos. Furniture was overturned and scattered across the floor, and the air was thick with dense, oppressive energy. The TV was on a static channel, and the lights were flickering erratically, as if trying to warn of an invisible presence. "What's happening?" Rebecca asked, her voice trembling. I thought the ritual worked. I was also surprised and worried. The feeling that something was about to happen was overwhelming. I went to the TV and turned it off, but the sense of dread didn't disappear. The environment was charged with an almost palpable tension, and every shadow seemed to move in a sinister manner. While we tried to understand what was happening, a new presence seemed to manifest. The environment began to transform subtly but disturbingly. The air was cold, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the sense of despair grew with each moment. We decided to check the house again, hoping to find some logical explanation for what was happening. We went from room to room, examining every detail, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The house seemed silent and lifeless, except for the emotional weight that seemed to accumulate. Then, as we passed through the hallway, we heard a faint whisper, almost inaudible, coming from one of the rooms. The sound was like a distant murmur, but clearly, someone or something was trying to communicate. Hesitant, we approached the room and opened the door. Inside the room, the atmosphere was heavy and oppressive. In the center, on a table, was a new photo, similar to the one we had seen before but with a notable difference. The photo seemed to deteriorate as we looked at it, and the image showed an even more disturbing scene than the previous one. It was an image of our house, but with distorted details and dark figures in the windows and doors. The sight of the photo made my heart race. What was happening? How could the photo appear again? And more importantly, what was it trying to tell us? Rebecca stood beside me, and I could see the same expression of panic and confusion on her face. The photo seemed to emit an almost electric energy, and the feeling that something was about to be revealed was overwhelming. With the photo in hand, we tried to investigate what it meant. We remembered the Everly diary and the references to the sinister presence that had tormented the family. It seemed the photo was linked to the force that had consumed the mansion and now was trying to manifest again in our house. The feeling that the ritual had only weakened the force but not eliminated it seemed to be confirmed. Determined to face whatever it was, we began preparing a new approach. We revisited the diary, looking for any detail we might have missed. We discovered a mention of an ancient protection spell that could seal the negative influence and prevent it from returning. The spell seemed complex, but its description offered hope that we could finally end the curse. The spell's preparation involved a set of detailed rituals and the use of specific items, including natural elements and ancestral symbols. The execution required precision and a strong spiritual concentration. Michael, the specialist who had helped us before, was called again to assist in performing the spell. On the night we performed the spell, the tension was palpable. The environment was charged with energy that seemed to pulse and vibrate. Michael guided us through the process, and as he chanted the ancient words, the house seemed to fill with a soft, protective light. The atmosphere was constantly changing, and the air seemed lighter as the spell progressed. The spell's climax was an intense experience. The sense of oppression seemed to be ripped from the house, and an invisible force seemed to fight against the intervention. However, as the final words were spoken and the symbols completed, the atmosphere began to transform. The environment was purifying, and the feeling of threat slowly began to disappear. At the end of the spell, a sense of relief spread through the house. The lights were stable, and the air was lighter. Although the tension was still present, it seemed we had managed to break the cycle of terror that had consumed us. The children were sleeping peacefully, and the feeling of being watched had diminished. From that moment on, the house began to regain its normalcy. The strange events became less frequent, and the feeling of oppression was replaced by a sense of peace. The sinister presence seemed to have finally been dispelled, and the curse's influence was finally under control. However, the experience left us with a deep understanding of the fragility of normalcy and the constant struggle between visible and invisible forces. The house, now calmer, was a constant reminder that the past is never truly dead and that facing our fears often requires courage and a desperate fight for peace. If you liked these stories, you can't miss Two True Scary Horror Stories compilation. For those who want to watch, click on the video in the card above or look for the previous video here on the channel. And, of course, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience too. Stay brave and see you in the next creepy story.